summit where the sovereign wealth funds come and talk with each other, and among other things. And there are a number of ministers, and they liked what I had to say, and so they invited me back again this year, and I put forward the proposal, which is actually the idea of my other colleagues in Fortune Nest for Bahrain, Silicon Valley, and that went into the papers, and that's picked up momentum since then.
Explain the 4G wireless that you're talking about and the IPv6. Why is it important, and what's not being done that you described at AT&T?
Sure. In my book, Brave New Unwired World, The Digital Big Bang and the Infinite Internet, I make the case for skipping 3G and going straight to 4G. So if you look at 1G, it's analog, it's easy to clone and hard to roam. 2G, and by the way, 1G was mostly frequency division. 2G is time division, and that's GSM. And the Europeans got together and found a way of doing roaming. So Nokia led an initiative called Nordic Mobile Radio, which competed against the Germans and the French. And so 2G was a real commercial explosion. Motorola would have had a big success, but the U.S. ITAR prohibited them from sending out their 128-bit encrypted mobile phones. So Nokia kind of jumped into the market gap there that was pretty much created by the U.S. government. Within 3G, over my objections, which were loud and which are in writing and through speaking, I said that the government shouldn't have all these auctions, but the governments were greedy and wanted to get $200 billion in extra taxation for their fastest-growing sector, and that set back 3G, which wasn't really much of a technological advance. It was code division, which is mostly part of Qualcomm's part of 2G anyway, and Korea had kind of a head start there. 4G, to me, is something radically different from 1, 2, and 3G. And what I wanted to do was to go in and just make a power grab with the telcos and say that while 1G, 2G, and 3G were all within the license band, in other words, you had to pay billions of dollars to play and get your first customer, that I wanted 4G to be both the licensed and the unlicensed band. And in fact, one company could be in both. So, for instance, Apple, when they have FaceTime on the phone, you're using Wi-Fi and you're using AT&T's network, that to me is along the lines of what I was thinking of with 4G. And you won't find any telco in the world that was recommending back when I wrote my book in 2001 that they should also be using unlicensed band. In fact, ironically, AT&T tried to kill Wi-Fi at the FCC and through backdoor meetings.
Wow.
And the only one company in the whole world stopped them. And I think that this is something I'm surprised is more widely known. It was Apple. So the irony that Apple and AT&T would team up is tremendous. But without Apple, there wouldn't necessarily be Wi-Fi, and there wouldn't necessarily be such widespread exploitation of the ISM, the industrial, scientific, and medical band. Notice it isn't the industrial, scientific, medical, and Wi-Fi band. So Apple did an amazing service because Apple is one of these companies that has a 10-year, 20-year vision of the future, and it has to do with making things available to people. That's not a telco vision. And so the place where I am radically philosophically different than the telcos is that I think that 4G wireless broadband should be free to some people. In other words, there should be architectures, there should be availability of it to some people where, like Wi-Fi, it's free. And there's no reason that you can't do that. The other major thing with 4G that just makes it fake to me is if you're not giving IPv6 addresses to the end user, in fact, many addresses per user, then it's not real 4G to me. Because the idea is like you have your phone number and I have my phone number. We have end-to-end connectivity. You can dial that my number and you know you're just going to reach me. But on the Internet, the IPv4 Internet, it's a 32-bit address, which means mathematically 2 to the 32nd power addresses, which to boil it all down comes to 4.3 billion. Now, the U.S. government has about 1 billion of those. U.S. corporations and universities have 1 billion. So about almost 6.7 billion people have to share 2 billion addresses. Well, that means you can't give even one address per person, much less one address for every car, every appliance. I have thought for a very long time that everything that costs more than $25, except for food, will be connected to the Internet. And IPv6 makes a leap to 128-bit addresses, which is 3.4 times 10 to the 38th power, or 340 trillion addresses, meaning you could give one to every manufactured product ever being made out until the heat death of the sun. and you still have, extra addresses left over. So it's an abundant space. It's a blue ocean possibility of giving every single person, place, and valuable thing addressable identity, which is good for managing theft and ownership. It's good for keeping things out of the hands of terrorists. It's good for, tracking pets and tracking children. And there are all kinds of reasons to do it. But the idea is that we have the ability to have what I call the ever smarter world. And these are all things that are very hard for one company to own. They take government involvement, like no one company should or could or should run that database exclusively. And so I spent years and millions of dollars, and also got 75 companies and NATO and most of the major economies of Asia to all agree with my vision for transitioning to IPv6. I even testified before Congress and got Congress to mandate IPv6 for all federal agencies and to include it as all procurement. But the irony is that when I stopped promoting it, it stopped really happening. So there was actually a greater percentage of traffic on IPv6 5 years ago than there is today. Today, it's only 1/5 of 1% of all IP traffic is IPv6.
Yes.
But we run out this year of IPv4 addresses. So a telco can't give you your own dedicated internet address. They were not visionary enough. They fought the internet. They had this free architecture, because there are certain architectures that lend themselves towards freedom and others that lend themselves towards lock-in and capture. And the telcos are united, as if they're sort of a political party that united that they must lock you in. And the only way to really have an efficient telecom system where computers and communications converge is for everybody to have their own IP address that they know, like what it is. Now, I've given talks all over the world, probably to 30, 40,000 people, and I've met exactly one person, and he was in Beijing, China, who, when I asked the audience, do you know your IP address? He said yes, and I asked him what it was, and I typed it in. And it was true. He really did have that address. But nobody knows their address, whereas everybody knows their phone number. So we actually have a measure of how primitive we are, how barbaric we are about open source broadband, wireless broadband, because of how few addresses people have that they know what they are.
Two things I want to say to you. One is that wasn't it you that helped convince the U.S. Department of Defense to improve the security of its networks and upgrade to IPv6?
Well, more than that. There was something that's true, but more fundamentally, the United States government, and in particular the Department of Defense, gets a lot of credit for funding the Internet. So DARPA, and with the brilliant leadership of still one of the smartest guys in the world, Dr. Larry Roberts, had this idea of sharing your resources. So if you got a computer with DARPA funding, you had to make it available to the network, to the ARPANET, also called DARPANET, depending on whether Republicans or Democrats were in charge at the time. And DARPA put in, and the U.S. federal government put in most of the first $50 million. Now, in 1990, we had $1.1 trillion of federal revenue. In 2000, we had $2.1 trillion in federal revenue. So from 90 to 2000, in that decade, we dropped an extra trillion in revenue. Nothing like that has ever happened in the history of the world. And people who deconstruct what the heck happened in the U.S. economy say that the Internet was responsible for up to half of that. So an extra $500 billion a year in revenue came because of the Internet, which means that the federal government invested $50 million one-time fee, and they got $500 billion a year. So that is a 1,000,000% return a year, every year. It is the greatest return on investment in history, and those are my numbers. I cannot believe with all the economists in the world that nobody else came up with that number. But what it says is that if the United States made that much from IPv4, there's an absolutely great reason to put plenty of money into IPv6. That was my argument. But what's amazing about this is that the Department of Defense has by far the largest IT budget, and the U.S. DoD had gone on walkabout, as I say, that's the most polite way I can say it, from the Internet, trying to substitute all these lame-brain other standards like gossip and stuff. I mean, even the name is terrible, instead of the Internet. And so I was pounding on them, please come back to the Internet, come back and take leadership, because if the federal government doesn't lead, it won't happen. And if the DoD doesn't lead, none of the other agencies of the federal government will want to sort of step in front of you.
What about